Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Being all dramatic and everything. So, this is the light analysis of this game for today. It is Sam Shankland versus Wesley. So, taking out around 7 of the FIDE Grand Prix. Third leg. Yes. So, for anybody who is coming from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay. Kamusta na aking makaibigan. I appreciate you very much for stopping by. But if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. All right, so we got D4. Knight comes to F6. We got C4, E6, Knight to F3. We got D5, and we do have G3. So we do have the Catalan on the board. It's one of my favorite openings. I think I do pretty well with it. Personally, we got Bishop to E7, Bishop to G2, castles. And, I mean, this is going to be about 80% of the games that you see are going to go in this fashion. Bishop to E7, you know, and just getting castle and everything is going to be pretty standard. And then it kind of branches off at this point. So we do see pawn taking C4. We got queen to C2. I mean, you can also go just simply knight to C3, or you can go knight to E5. Knight to E5 and queen to C2, knight to A3 are going to be the most, you know, they're going to be the most aggressive ways to play it. But, you know, with computers these days, you can play it pretty much kind of how you want within a, you know, certain degree. So we do see queen to C2. We got A6. We see A4. We got bishop to D7. Queen takes C4. And then we kind of have like a little Fort Knox situation going on with the bishop here kind of wrapping itself back around to C6. You know, just if you got this knight moving anywhere like this, you know, the bishop is probably going to go ahead and take on G2. Bishop comes to G5. Knight B to D7. We see knight to C3. We got H6. Bishop comes back down to D2. And then we do have A5. You know, we don't really want white to push A5 because that is going to be, you know, whether it's on this square going to be, you know, preventing B5 from coming. But it's also going to be like freezing these pawns here like this. So, you know, we don't really want that to be the case. So we do see A5. We got queen down to D3. We see bishop to B4, a rook F to E1, and then we see rook to E8. And this is the novelty of the game. Pretty natural move, though. You know, you're just trying to support the queen coming here. Maybe a pawn push coming to E5. We do see queen to C2. Bishop takes F3. Bishop takes F3. And, I mean, it's generally, you know, accepted that you don't really want to trade a bishop for a knight just to be trading. You know, you kind of want to get something in return because, you know, a lot of people consider bishops to be slightly better than knights. And I mean, it depends on the position. Closed positions are knights, open positions are bishops. The position is somewhat open, so the bishops are kind of favored just a little bit. But after C6, it does close the position just a little bit. So we do see rook E to D1. We got queen to E7. We see bishop up to E3. We see rook A to C8. We see knight down to A2. And, I mean, the unfortunate thing about knight to A2 is it doesn't really attack much because the bishop's not going to leave itself there. It's going to, you know, kind of go back. So you're looking at bishop to D6 and then bishop down to D2. You know, placing an attack on this pawn over here, but it is very easily defended with bishop to C7. You know, B6 was also something you could have done, or maybe even C5 as well. Just tossing a little counter attack on it. On the position in the center. But after bishop to C7, we do see knight to C3. Bishop comes to D6. We see E4, and then black basically stops it by pushing E5. And you don't have the same oomph behind the E4 that you would like to. So the knight does come down to E2. We see bishop back to B4. We see bishop up to E3. Rook C comes to D8. We see H3, you know, just creating a little bit more space for the king. We got pawn taking D4, knight taking D4. We got queen to C5. And it's kind of a critical position that we have here. If you want to go ahead and pause the video before we get into what was played in the game. If you want to go ahead and pause the video and see what white has the ability to play here, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So white can actually play a waiting move very legitimately in this position. I think it's really hard to find. I honestly don't feel like I would have found it myself in the game. But it is actually bishop back to G2. just kind of seeming like you're just kind of making some type of random waiting move, allowing the queen to take on c2, knight taking on c2, and allowing black to kind of think that they have won a pawn, you know, not being worried about giving up the bishop. So we're hoping that black plays here, but this would actually be a blunder because the knight would be taking on b4. After pawn takes back, we got bishop taking, rook taking, and then we have bishop up to b6. And this is a real problem because this knight is pinned to this rook. And so you can't, you know, capture this bishop because you're going to be giving away the rook. And you do have a much better piece, you know, over a bishop. You know, so you'll have the exchange. And so you're probably going to be forced to kind of go back rook e to e8, give up the exchange, something like this. And that is not very desirable to a position to be in. Congratulations if you did find bishop to g2. You'd be super gangster. But like I said, after knight takes d4, we see queen to c5. And then we see Sam Shankland actually avoid the trade. So he goes queen to b3. After the queen goes back to f8, we see the queen going back down to c2, and we actually see knight to c5. And the unfortunate thing about this is the knight, and the rook are all three hitting this pawn, and there is not a way for you to defend this pawn. So you are going to be down a pawn as white. So the knight does come to f5, and we're hoping that black starts to just capture pawns immediately with one of these knights. But you have to be very careful because when you do have rooks next to each other on the back rank, whenever one of these rooks take, especially the outside one, it's going to be forcing the rook over. So we don't want to be taking immediately because that would be allowing white to deflect your rook away. And now you are just winning an entire piece. So we saw Wesley So make the very accurate rook takes d1 with check first. You know, making sure that that is not an issue. And after the rook takes on d1, we see knight c taking e4. And now we are all good to go for black. So the bishop comes to d4. We see g6 knocking the knight. The knight comes down to e3. We see h5. So as you can see, black is just starting to, like, you know, get more space. They're starting to kind of impose their will on white just a little bit. So the knight comes to c4. There's going to be a lot of like hoovering stuff off the board. And a lot of very specific play. But we do see queen down to e7. The bishop comes down to g2 now. Bishop comes up to c5 because black is really wanting to trade pieces in these positions because they are up a pawn. So usually when you're up any material, when you're starting to trade down, it does just make your, you know, advantage just grow. So the bishop takes on f6. We see knight taking f6, knight taking a5. Queen down to e2, and this is forcing the trade because you are looking at either the bishop or the queen checking on f2, so you have to do something about it. Queen takes e2, rook takes e2, you got knight taking b7, bishop taking f2, and then we do see king over to f1. We see rook takes b2, knight, bishop takes c6, bishop takes g3, and then we do have a5. You know, at the moment, these pieces are actually doing a pretty good job of kind of holding each other. And so we do see rook over to f2. The king goes over, sidesteps to g1. You definitely don't want to go to e1 because the rook is going to be going to c2, discovering a check, and you are losing your bishop. So the rook goes to a2. We see rook over to f1. Just why not attack the knight over there? We got king down to g7. Bishop goes to b5. We see bishop down to h2 with check. The king steps over to h1. We see knight down to e4. Rook takes f7 with check, and this is a very crafty move because if we do see king taking f7, we have bishop to c4 with check, and this is basically just completely like making the game dead even, and your advantage as black is completely gone. So, you know, Wesley So very accurately steps to h6. We see rook down to f3. Knight goes to g3 with check, and this is the reason we move the rook down because we are trying to defend against the mate that would be here if we didn't have the rook at f3. So the rook takes g3, bishop takes g3, we see a6. King comes down to g5, we see knight to c5. We got king down to h4, and you guys can see that the king is getting in a really, really nice position. You really want to try to use your king as much as possible when you get into endgames. Bishop comes down to f1. We see bishop to b8. We got knight down to e4. Bishop comes to a7. So, I mean, you know, you can see that, you know, white is in a nice little box here. So the knight comes down to c3. We see rook to f2. Bishop comes to g2. We don't want to just lose our bishop for free. The rook comes over to c2, and it is in this position that Sam Shankland does resign the game. And the reason that he is resigning the game is basically just to show you a variation. You're pretty much getting mated in every possible way in this position. You know, there really isn't a way for you to move your knight, but if you do, it doesn't really matter where you move it, you're losing. So let's just put knight to e4 on the board. Rook would come down and check on c1. The king would go up to h2. The bishop would come back to b8, and you have to throw the knight in the way some kind of way. So let's just say knight to g3. Knight to d6 is also another move. Bishop taking on g3, and that is checkmate. So this bishop really kind of like hurt the king because it didn't really give you know, him anywhere to go to escape. So you have to be careful when you have like pieces right next to your king because you can be mated or smothered. But that is that game. I appreciate you guys very much for coming by. Maraming salamat aking makaibigan. I will see everybody next time.